Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead, and I'm back with another story. And it is one of my favorites. It's called Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. The Tale of Peter Rabbit. This was one of my favorites when I was young. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank under the root of a very big fir tree. And that's where they lived. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go to the fields or down the lane, but do not go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there, and he was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." What do you think that meant? He was put in a pie. That's right. Those people would eat rabbits. So here she is telling them what to do. And they all listened carefully. But Peter, wrong one. Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the woods to the baker's. She brought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. I love blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed in under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and he ate some radishes, and then he felt rather sick, so he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of the cucumber frame, whom should he meet? But Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter Rabbit, waving his rake and calling out, "Stop, thief! Stop!" That wasn't Peter's garden to be eating out of. Oops, just a second. These 2 pages do not want to come apart. I got it. Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe among the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have gotten away altogether if he had not, unfortunately, ran into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly little sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to please try to get away. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop over the top of Peter, but Peter wiggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps carefully hidden under a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully and look under each one. Presently, Peter sneezed. Ka-choo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out the window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. So he went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea of which way to go. Also, he was damp or wet sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going limpity-limpity, not very fast, and looking around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze under. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone steps, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. And poor Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became even more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her, but he had heard about his cat from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. The cat would go after a little rabbit. He went back to the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttled under the bushes. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed into a little wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped under the gate and was at last safe in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. See that? That's his little scarecrow he made. He was so tired he flopped down on the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole, shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. That's in 2 weeks. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea and gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. After all, they had been good little bunnies that obeyed. And Peter had not. So, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. It's a good idea to do what your mom and dad say. They want you to be safe. And I want you to be safe too. So, whatever you do, keep dreaming, keep a story in your heart, and I'll be back to read to you tomorrow.